Welcome to our third Wednesday of the month Backyard Wildlife Program with Camano Wildlife Habitat Project. And this is our 20th year of doing the program, so thank you for joining in. We now have 1,011 plus a few I need to check on, certified habitats on Camano, certified by the National Wildlife Federation. So let me tell you a little bit about our project, and then I'll introduce Deborah Smeltzer and we'll learn about moss and lichen. So let's go. We are an island in harmony with nature, one yard at a time, and this is our way to kind of do something, have an action step. So there's a lot of development going on, and rather than be frustrated and cry when the logging trucks roll off the island, this is our action step to sort of link up backyards. And if we think of areas of our yard as like area 1 being around the house, area 2 kind of a middle ground where there's not a lot, there's kind of like some action going, but not as much as near the house. And then area 3, kind of the back of the yard. Those area 3s can link up and restore some corridors and link up with the parks on the island. So the habitat can be as small as a rooftop garden or a deck, or it can be as large as like Four Springs, the 50-acre park on the island. So this is a work in progress when you're landscaping for wildlife. So when I moved to the island in '94, we had a nice little lawn there in front. Our house is down below on the water, and we just had grass on the top of the hill, and then the garage is behind, up the driveway behind the car. And so big view, but lots of grass and not really doing anything for wildlife because a lawn and a tree is a bit sterile. So with the work in progress in 2007, it is where we have the trail, and the kind of the left side of the pathway we have shore pine and some salal and ground cover and understory and trees. And so we did the left side, and then we went over and later on did the right side. So we've done our yard. We don't have grass any longer except for some that's grown up in the driveway. And so we think of it as a work in progress. And now on those hot days that haven't happened yet, but when they come, we have it nice and lush. Well, the neighbors have it like the first picture there, and it's really hot on a hot sunny day. Well, for us, it's nice and cool. And lots of understory there for the critters to hide in. So when you're doing a wildlife habitat, you're thinking about food, water, shelter, and places to raise young. And the food, shelter, and places to raise young all kind of work together in the plants that you do. Even the water can. I once saw a leaf with a little frog that went way down to where there was a little cup of water, like a thimbleful for the little frog. And so the logs that we, if you have a larger property and can leave like a nurse log, the logs have waters for insects. So what we do in our yard and what we let stay in our yard is providing the food, water, places to raise young. So besides providing those basics, there's also things that you can do that's responsible gardening. So getting rid of the lawn, and that's just good for living on an island with our single source aquifer, growing natives rather than more sterile ornamentals. We want to conserve water on the island. To be certified, you don't have to do all these things at once, but you start to be more conscientious about the things you do. So maybe you use a little bit of chemicals, but after a while you see, oh, well, I have this bird feeder here and I really like watching the birds, so maybe I want to stop using that. So this is our action step to get people to be a little bit more conscientious about what we're doing in our yards. And so, and then by doing that, we have all those area 3s, those the back parts of the yards that kind of link up, and you can actually, restore the corridor. You have a deer corridor there or other things. Anyway, it's easy to do, and it's a simple application. You can get the application on our website. You can go directly to the National Wildlife Federation and certify online. I have applications, our applications like this inside the library in a little stand near the bathroom where they have that hallway of literature of programs for the community. And then outside I have a generic application that you send directly to the National Wildlife Federation. So we have people send them to us so I can count, so I know that today that we for sure have 1,011 certified wildlife habitats on the island. But you can see it's a simple checklist of how you're providing food, water, shelter, places to raise young. And the National Wildlife Federation kind of looks at, the acreage, and then they can say how much acreage is certified wildlife habitat in the nation. There's more than 200,000 that have certified in the nation. So it's an action step for the nation. And for communities. So once you certify, you can put up a yard sign. I meet people at the park and ride near the library at Terry's Corner, in the park and ride by the bus shelter, and with signs. So if you want to certify, or you are certified and want to put up a sign, this is a nice way to say, okay, my gardens maybe looking a little messy. Well, I have this sign, a little bit of yard art, and so it kind of makes the little bit of you know, mess that some people may think that isn't really a mess, more purposeful. And then there's also the National Wildlife Federation. So to get either sign, you need to have a certification number. You need to be certified as a wildlife habitat. And so the National Wildlife Ranger Rick sign you get right online. You can order it, and I can meet you at the park and ride to get you a Camano sign. So these are all the dots on our island. Well, it's not quite. This is with 700 habitats. So you can see that we have 400 more dots on the island. So you can see it's spread out, and it's going with that idea that we want to link yards. So we have neighborhood habitats on the island. We have 9 of those, I believe, and besides our 1,011 certified wildlife habitats. And it's a community action step. So you can see Camano, we were the 2nd in the state, the 10th in the nation. There are now 18 in the state, and there are 148 certified habitats in the nation. So this is a way, as a community, we can make a statement that we care about the wildlife on our island, and we want to share our space. And we've come to the island, and we don't just want 5 acres of lawn. We want habitat that makes it lush, an oasis, and we're sharing our space. So you can get more information from the National Wildlife Federation. They have a great native plant site, or part of their site, that's really kind of interesting. The Native Plant Society does that as well, and I assume the Master Gardeners has things as well. And then and on our website we have a lot of information. You can go back and look at our programs as well. We have our programs that we record, and so you can look at those. And if you want to get some more information about tonight's program, you can go back and look at it again. So these are some references. The 2 on the top, Living with Wildlife, Landscaping for Wildlife, are by Russell Link. He is a Washington State Fish and Wildlife Department biologist. And so these are specific for the Pacific Northwest, and they're nice resources. So like the Living with Wildlife, if you are thinking that the deer might be a problem, then you can go there and get some ideas of what plants to use. I know in one garden book, one guy plants a hedge, and he has one side for the deer and one side for him. And so everyone's getting along just beautifully. And so those 2 books are real nice, specifically for the Pacific Northwest. And then the bottom one is the National Wildlife Federation's Backyard Wildlife book. And this is their new edition. And there we go. So thank you for being a part of our program. Now let me, I'll tell you what's coming up in July, and then I'll introduce Deborah. So here we go. Jane Billinghurst is going to be here next time, and she's going to talk about the art of forest walking. She's just a co-author of the new book, Discovering the Trees and Wood. I've got this. Forest Walking, Discover the Trees and Woodlands of North America. So she's going to come and give us a talk in July, so that'll be really fun. And tonight, we're going to learn about moss and lichen. So we're going to learn about the little forests out there in the woods. If you bring your little, I don't know what, the reverse scope and look at things in tiny, it's a little forest. And so let me tell you about Deborah Smeltzer. She is a Skagit County Master Gardener. She's the chair of the training team. She's a member of the website team. She's done many programs in education, such as things on soil, compost, moss, lichen, fungi, and oh, the list goes on and on. If you had a chance to read the bio before I flick the screen, you can learn even more of all the little details. But what's really cool is that Deborah was the Skagit County Master Gardener Intern of the Year in 2012 when she moved to the area and took the Master Gardener class. Then in 2014, she was the Skagit County Master Gardener of the Year. First, she was the Intern of the Year. Then she was the Master Gardener of the Year. And then in 2020, the Washington State Master Gardener of the Year. So it's really cool to have Deborah here because we know that she really cares about what she's talking about, what she's doing, and she's getting some kudos for it too because she's definitely working hard to be able to receive those honors. So with that, let you meet Deborah Smeltzer, Master Gardener at Skagit County, and she can tell us about moss and lichen. So welcome, and I will get out of here.
Thank you, Val. Very nice introduction. You'll embarrass me. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I'm very pleased to be here tonight to talk to you. I know I was here several years ago live and shared a talk as well, and it changes a little bit every year. First, I want to acknowledge Christine Faro, who took a lot of the photos you'll see tonight in my presentation. She was in the same class as me as a Master Gardener, and she's the one that actually talked me into adding lichens to the talk when I first started off with mosses. My own background is in medical microbiology, so I've come to horticulture later in life and really enjoy learning about different life forms and all kinds of things as part of what I do as a Master Gardener educator. And I'm not an expert in either of these, but I really do love talking about them. And I hope that you will come away from this presentation tonight loving mosses and lichens and finding them whenever you're out walking in the forest. So I always like to figure out what my audience wants to learn, and it's a little harder on Zoom because we're not quite as interactive, but some people think of mosses and lichens as friends that they can find in the forest. And this is a real photo. This isn't photoshopped or anything else. But sometimes, people wonder if some of these life forms can be foes, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight as well. So when I first did some research on this topic and I did an internet search on moss, the first thing that came up was how to get rid of it, and also about these other kinds of what I call the Northwest garden regulars, liverworts and fungi and mildew and algae. So most of the time people are trying to figure out how to get rid of them. And some of what we're going to talk about will address times and places when that might be appropriate, but also to give you an appreciation for what these life forms really are. So we're going to talk first about moss, and I'm going to cover what moss is, the cultural characteristics. I have some beautiful portraits because of those great photos that my friend Christine took. Fun facts about moss, when it's a friend and when it's a foe, how to control it when it's needed. And we can pause at that point and do some Q&A, or we can hold it at the end and we'll just see where we go with that when we get to that point. So what is moss? Well, it's a bryophyte, and the bryophyte class includes things like liverworts and hornworts. There's about 15,000 different species in this group of primitive plants. They are simple and non-vascular. And there's fossil records of mosses from over 350 million years ago. So they're a very early stage plant in our evolution. They do not have a true root system. And I think that's really important to understand, both in terms of how they grow and how to control them when needed. They attach to their substrate through these rhizoids. So it's very superficial. And it's pretty important that they have what's called a gametophyte, which is the part of the plant that is the green part that when you see mossy green, that's the gametophyte. And the sporophyte is this portion where the spores are formed for reproduction. And they're usually on this long, very thin thread-like structure called a seta. So there are no flowers. So that's one of the things that distinguishes mosses from the other tracheophytes, which are flowering plants, as well as conifers and regular ferns. Club mosses, horsetails are all in a different class of plants. And one of the things we're going to talk about is that they absorb water and nutrients through their single-celled systems. So here's a nice picture of a Plagiothecium undulatum. That's this wavy, this light green moss, along with several others, as well as some lichens on this stump. But I think it's a good example, this picture showing the kind of cultural characteristics that we're going to learn about. So mosses need areas that are damp. They thrive best in under moist conditions. And they can be found on many different substrates, either tree trunks or soil, rocks, even on buildings, or any place where the conditions are favorable for their growth. They absorb and drink water from their environment for nourishment. They have a similar habitat to things like algae, so they're sometimes confused with algae, but algae is a very different class of organism. And algae lack leafy stems. And they exist as a cluster of cells. They're not a true plant. So that's one of the ways to differentiate. Mosses can grow in mounded clumps, in thin patches, or in tendrils that hang from trees. And we'll see some of those examples in a moment. And they reproduce via spore or even from cut segments of the plant. So here's just a few portraits to kind of get us started. Some fairly common mosses. This particular one is called Polytrichum juniperinum, or juniper haircap moss. This one in the lower right is Kinbergia oreganum, and it used to be in the genus Eurychium, and it can be found both on rock and wood. You'll see some of these life forms that can use different substrates and some that are always on the same substrate. And this picture up top, we didn't actually identify these particular mosses, but I thought it was a really good example of the rounded forms that you see fairly frequently. So a few more portraits. Here's this wavy leaf cotton moss again, the Plagiothecium undulatum, a nice close-up showing how the leaves of this moss form and make these long tendrils. Here's a classic picture from the Pacific Northwest on a fence rail where you just see all different kinds of moss growing. And then this is a lovely picture in the woodland areas of Hylocomium splendens, or what's called steppe moss. It will form an 8-inch deep cushion that you can really just walk through. So this is pretty typical of the different kinds of mosses that we can see. Now, the plant and stem color, and the shape of the branch is all dependent on the different genus and species. And one thing that's interesting about moss is that the plants may hold anywhere from 16 to 26 times as much water as their dry weight, all depending on the species. So that's one of the reasons mosses can be used for some of the things we'll talk about in a moment. I do want to spend a couple minutes on peat mosses, which is in the genus Sphagnum. They're well known to us because they've been used in the horticultural industry for a long time. And we want to talk about some of the issues around that as well. So in a close-up of a peat moss or sphagnum moss, you have the sporangium that forms and creates this, what we call a capitulum here. And then where the spore is actually formed is in this structure here. And then this is a blow up or cross section of the cells. And one of the things that makes sphagnum moss so unique is the fact that it can hold so much water within this cell structure. And that's pretty important in terms of how it's been used, both culturally and in the industry. Here's some nice pictures. Here's a close-up showing that array that you see at the top and the beautiful form that it takes. And then this is an aerial photo of a wetland bog with moss and hummock. And these are found predominantly in the northern latitudes on Earth. And peat accumulations provide habitat for a wide array of peatland plants, including sedges and heather-like shrubs, as well as orchids and carnivorous plants. Sphagnum and peat formed from it do not decay readily because of the phenolic compounds that are embedded in this moss's cell walls. In addition, these bogs, like all wetlands, develop anaerobic soil conditions, which produce slower anaerobic decay than aerobic microbial action. So that means that peat mosses will acidify their surroundings, and they end up taking up things like cations, such as calcium and magnesium, and then they release hydrogen ions. So under the right conditions, peat can accumulate to a depth of many meters. And they're, as I mentioned earlier, they're mostly in the northern hemisphere in peat bogs, conifer forests, and moist tundra areas. So why should we be concerned? And I want to talk a little bit about the issues around peat moss. So first of all, peatlands are very diverse ecosystems with important environmental functions, both for water quality and storing carbon from the atmosphere. When they're degraded from either over-harvesting or other damages, they then become environmentally non-functional. And that means there's increased water loss and water quality, and the decreased capacity to store atmospheric carbon. So there are efforts to restore peatlands today, and that can make them partially functional again and reduce the water loss. But that effort can oftentimes contribute more to global CO2 production than even degraded peatlands. So it's still an issue. And it's considered by many to be a non-renewable resource. The replacement after harvesting peat bogs can take centuries. So this isn't something that we'll see in our lifetime in terms of renewing this resource. And horticultural peat moss can be, the use of it can be reduced by using a number of available materials that are much more feasible economically and certainly much more environmentally friendly. And there's been a lot of research done, especially in the UK, about this, less in the United States, but we're seeing a real transition now. So what are some of those alternatives? First of all, when we're planting trees and shrubs, we should stop backfilling transplantations with soil amended with peat moss. We've learned it's much better, first of all, to use native soil when you're planting. That's considered now best practices, and it certainly then would not be using this precious resource. There are other types of soil amendments that can be used for potting soils. Coir is one of them. And in addition, there's a lot of wood products, things that come out of the lumber or timber industry that as waste products that make equally viable substitutes for peat moss in potting mixes and soils. And the key there is just to make sure that there's no excess salts or other chemicals in any of these products because of how they might have been processed. As master gardeners, we recommend that if you're going to use new amendments for potting soils, and we're really talking about for potting plants in pots, not in natural settings, you really want to test whether it works and make sure, especially if you're worried about germination. A lot of peat moss products are used for seed starting mixes and things like that. And a lot of us these days start our own seeds. So you want to make sure that you have a viable environment for that to happen. But what's really good to know is that alternatives might provide a more nutrient-rich medium and might even create better drought resistance for the plants that you grow in them. And that has other benefits, such as decreasing your fertilizer applications and having more drought-resistant transplants. So there's lots of really good reasons to do this. And there's some really good resources, and the resource list that I provided includes both Linda Chalker-Scott's article about the myth of permanent peatlands that she wrote in 2010. And then there was a very good article that came out earlier this year in February in the New York Times about how gardeners should think about this in a different way. So I encourage you to look those up if you're interested in finding better alternatives. So as I mentioned earlier, mosses have been used in many different ways, and not just peat moss, but many other mosses. And this is down through the centuries of human occupation from the Stone Age to our present day. And I'm not going to read all of these. You can look at these on the slide, but the uses include things like household and daily living uses. We've heard of dried peat for fuel, and that was a pretty common fuel for a long time in Northern Europe, less so today. But the other thing is mosses can be used for many things, like insect repellent or packing fragile objects because of their sponginess. Obviously, we talked a little bit about gardening already and the horticultural use of especially peat moss. But in medicine also, mosses were very valuable during times of lack of other kinds of materials for bandages. They were used a lot during the US Civil War as both an absorbent and an antimicrobial. Mosses are used in food, and they're also used in scientific activities, such as using them as a bioindicator for air quality. So lots of interesting uses over the ages. So let's talk a minute now about moss. I have a couple photos here of nice accents in the garden. Sorry. And one of the things we can think about is moss gardening. And several of the references I have are from people that have focused a lot on how to garden with moss and different ways to use moss in beautiful settings. And there are several gardens that I'll talk about a little bit later where you can go and visit full moss gardens, and those are also listed on your research for that. But then there are also times when moss can be a foe, and moss can grow on roofs and cause problems. It can grow on walkways where it retains too much moisture. So these are times when we have to be thoughtful about what we can do and how to deal with moss that is not helping our environment. A notorious one here in the Pacific Northwest is Ceratodon purpureus. We almost really consider it a weed because it's found pretty prolifically everywhere. You find it often on roofs, and I find it growing in my driveway, and I'll show you some pictures in just a moment, some close-ups of it. So the question is, in fact, here it is, right here. I took this during the spring about a year ago when the moss was putting up its sporangia, and it was actually very beautiful in some ways. I also found a very interesting article called One Badass Moss, and they sometimes call it fireweed because of this color. But the moss leaves, when you look close up, they can be very beautiful, even though they can cause a lot of problems in certain areas. So what do we do? There are publications. WSU Extension has a publication about structural and turf demossing and what you can do about it. Of course, moss is a problem in the Pacific Northwest because of excess moisture, especially here on the west side, and some of the issues that can become a problem. So when we're asked as master gardeners, what do you do? Well, our first option is usually a mechanical option to change the conditions and or prevent the conditions that favor moss when it's growing in places we don't want it. So if you have a lot of shade, you need to prune overhanging branches, remove leaf debris. You can do this, as I said, mechanically by sweeping and hand removal. If the surface is appropriate, you can use low pressure power washing. If you're looking at installing a new roof, then you might want to consider using materials that are more resistant to moss. Things like fiberglass or sheet metal are much less favorable substrates for moss than a wood shake roof or other kinds of materials. There are options for chemical control if mechanical control cannot be affected. And some of these are liquid products. And we always recommend if you're going to put a liquid product on your roof, you want to disconnect your downspout so you're not contaminating the environment when the stuff leaches off the roof. Also, roofs should only be treated in dry weather, and you should use a least toxic product at the minimum concentration that should be effective. Copper and zinc strips can also be very effective in controlling moss. And on this slide, this shows a good picture of this, where a zinc trim around a skylight, you can see how effective that the zinc leaching off of this strip has done to prevent the moss growing on the shake roof around that area, whereas other areas that aren't getting the zinc are obviously pretty heavily infested with moss. Now let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the lawn. I don't know about you, but when I bought the house I live in today, one of the things I discovered very early on is that I had a lot of moss growing in the lawn. And I didn't know enough then to know that it's because of the cultural conditions. Moss is not able to displace established grass, but it will take advantage of bare spots. And if the conditions are moist and retain moisture, very shady, turf grass likes a lot of sun and likes good fertility. Mosses can grow where there's low fertility and where it's shady and damp. And so you can get a nice green carpet of moss, and in some cases, it might even be preferable to a turf lawn. But for people that are looking for turf for other reasons, either for a play area or just because of the conditions of their yard, then they're looking to control the moss in their grass. So once again, if you don't deal with the underlying conditions that cause moss to grow, such as too much shade, you have to address those if you want to change the situation. So to get rid of moss in lawns, you need to increase the sunlight and decrease the shade. You have to get rid of some of that water, either change your drainage or water less frequently. And then if you want the turf grass to grow, you have to improve the health for the turf grass. And that means better air circulation, more fertile conditions, increase the mowing height so you're not stressing the grass. And it's a very different approach than what you're trying to do if you want a moss lawn. I can't recommend chemical control. They're very much pesticides are a temporary solution because it's really about the cultural conditions. And if you try to get rid of your moss with these rid moss products, and if you don't change the cultural conditions we just talked about, the moss will just come back. And it could be in as little time as a year, or it might take a couple of years. So there are controls if it's really called for. But as an alternative, you might just consider growing a moss lawn. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment. I put on this slide, and I won't read all the detail, but it's there for you if you want it. Cortex is one of the resources we use as master gardeners to get information to share with home gardeners. And one of the first things they talk about, once again, is the biology. So here's the penultimate bullet point here. Mosses in lawn generally result from low soil fertility, high soil acidity, heavy shade, improper watering practices, diseased grass, poorly drained soil, compacted soil, or any combination of these. So that's really what you have to address if you want to deal with it. And Hortson strongly recommends what I just went through, which is deal with the cultural conditions, and then you can deal with moss if you don't want it in your lawn area. So this is what I've done at my house. This is a very shady area, as you can see. This happens to be a photograph in front of my carriage house or my guest house. It's heavily wooded. I've got big Douglas firs. I have let this whole area go, and I actually cultivate the moss here. I would love to get rid of all the grass, but right now it's kind of a nice hybrid between the two. But the nice thing about the moss lawn is that I don't have to mow it. The moss kind of takes care of itself. It's nice and cushiony. It's cool and refreshing. I can tread on it. It's not going to be a place to play soccer, but it's still beautiful, and it certainly graces my yard and my garden. So it's what makes me very happy, and I encourage any of you that have these kind of conditions to consider letting the moss be and letting it do its job for you in the rest of your garden. You know, during different times of the year, especially the fall, when the dry season goes away and all of a sudden you have a lot of rain, this is when we see moss showing up in lots of places. This happens to be part of my front walkway where I have pavers installed next to my driveway on the path to my front door. And I let the moss grow here because it's beautiful. It's not slippery, it's not hazardous, but I find it very attractive. This is literally across from my front door. This is an area where the moss has moved in. I've encouraged it. In addition to moss, some of these ferns occur naturally and some of them I've planted, but I also have Cornus canadensis, which is creeping dogwood or bunchberry, and it's just beautiful. And so this is something that you can do too if you're interested. And I keep the leaves off of this so that the moss will thrive. And this is full shade almost all year long. So it's a good place for a moss garden, and I think it's very beautiful. So another place where you might not want moss to emerge, especially in the fall, is on your gravel driveways or pathways. This can become a problem because it kind of takes over, and it can hold enough water that these areas can be pretty soggy and more hazardous. So one thing that you can do in situations like this is pretty easily just dig it up with a hoe or weeder. You can remove it by hand, or you can also use a flame weeder to kill the moss and spores without disrupting the rest of the garden or causing any damage to your plants around you. Especially in gravel, this is a pretty easy way to control it. And it doesn't take as much effort as you might think, because remember, moss doesn't have roots. It comes up pretty easily. You just need to really dislodge it from the gravel and kill some of the spores if you don't want it to keep returning or spreading. So once again, where you get moss growing on hardscapes, you've got to minimize the water and soil flowing onto these impermeable surfaces where the moss will be inclined to grow. There are herbicidal soaps that can help control things like algae, lichens, and mosses, and so that's one of the other approaches you can take. But what's really key is you need to keep any of those pesticides out of waterways and away from any of your desirable plants, because these types of products that will clean your hard surfaces where moss is a problem will also be very detrimental to any plants that they splash on or coat during that process. So I love to think of moss and as a beautiful accent in the garden. This is really more of a forest setting, but there's a picture that Christine took right on the edge of a homeowner's property. So you can have this kind of beautiful mossy garden area if you have the right conditions. And I'm a real advocate to trying to incorporate these into our gardens as opposed to get rid of them. Okay, I am ready to transition to lichens. I'm just going to ask Val and Roxy, do we have any questions that we need to take now, or should I just keep going?
Keep going.
Okay, that's great. All right, thank you. All right, so lichens. We're going to now talk about lichens, kind of along the same lines that we talked about mosses. We're going to talk about what it is, what it needs to grow. We're going to look at some beautiful portraits, some fun facts, and talk about whether it's a problem or a friend, and if we need to control it, how. This particular photograph was taken by another master gardener, Nancy Kroll. We had a hummingbird nest in the eucalyptus tree at the Discovery Garden several years ago, and this was a great close-up shot showing how hummingbirds use all different kinds of lichens as part of their nest building materials. And that's one of the things that they do that happens a lot in Mother Nature, as these organisms get repurposed for many different things, including wildlife habitat. So what is lichen? So it's a very unique symbiotic organism that's composed of, as we now have learned, 2 fungi, an alga, which is a eukaryote and is photosynthetic. That's really important. We'll come back to that. And then sometimes you will find a cyanobacterium. This is the common name for these are blue-green algae, but they are also photosynthetic. So why is this important? So lichen needs fungi to provide the structure, and they need the alga to provide the photosynthesis or to create the food. And that is why this is symbiotic structure. You can't have a lichen without fungi and some form of alga working together. They have been classified in the fungal kingdom because of the fungal component. And this is a pretty wide range of different species, 14 to 20,000 species. And part of the problem is we just don't know. There's lots of lichens out there that have not been classified yet by scientists. Similar to mosses, they also can have many different substrates. It can be anything from soil, rock, or trees. And oftentimes the substrate is unique for the combination of the fungi and the alga that form a specific kind of lichen. So they're oftentimes even considered a true microbial ecosystem all on their own. And we'll look at several different types. This photograph here is of a cladonia or a pixie cup lichen that actually was taken when there was frost. And you can see how beautiful little ice crystals form on this beautiful little lichen. So in 2016, there was a report in Science magazine about the third partner that is embedded in the lichen cortex. And even at the time this publication occurred, they still weren't clear whether this was true in all lichens or just in some. I think the general consensus is now among most scientists studying this that is most likely in all lichens. So this second fungi is actually a Basidiomycetes, which is a yeast. It's a single-celled fungi. And it's believed that the reason it pairs up with a different fungi and the alga cells is because they produce chemicals that act as a repellent for other predators of lichens. And they also have speculated that it's probably important in forming the shape of the lichen thallus. The thallus is this structure that we're going to look at here microscopically in the next slide. So this is an electron micrograph of a lichen thallus, and this is a stained version of it, where the green is the yeast that is on one surface of it. The blue is the filamentous fungi that creates a structure, and the red staining is actually the algae cells that include the chlorophyll, where the food production, photosynthesis happens and provides food to the organism. So when we look at the anatomy of a lichen, you have this upper cortex, which is made up of fungal hyphae, or in some cases, the yeast organism. And then you have the layer where you have the algae, which does the photosynthesis. And then you have what's called the medulla, or the kind of inside part of the lichen, and then a lower cortex. So this is just a schematic diagram. This is actually a cross section of an algae that's been colored, of a lichen that's been colored, so you can see those structures. And this is at about 480 times magnification, so you get a sense of how small these structures are. We then look at, how this forms. So here's your lichen, and it has fruiting bodies called the ascocarp of the fungus. You have the fungal hyphae that form the structure, the algal layer that allows for the photosynthesis. And then you can have reproduction from the fungal partner only, or you can get what is called asexual reproduction, where these fragments of fungal material with the algae break off, wind, rain, etc., float away, and they colonize somewhere else, and they reproduce and they grow. So these are some good pictures to show you what the structure of these and the anatomy looks like. There are three basic types of lichens, and we're going to briefly look at all three. The first one I want to discuss is called the crustose form. And these, when you look at, in this case, a tree, but you might also see this on a rock, it almost looks like spray paint on the substrate. It looks kind of like dust or crust or scale. So very, very tiny, very flat against the surface. And that's one form of a lichen. And there's no lower cortex in this type of lichen. And it attaches directly to the substrate. In the case of the foliose lichens, they're like leafy growths, and they're usually divided into lobes, as you can see here. Sorry, I hit the button, sorry. Very leafy growths, and they form a leaf or a club shape that's pretty typical. This is a moss, and these are the lichens here. And this one happens to be called a hood bone lichen. And then the third type is the fruticose lichens, which are very bushy growths. They almost look like a little shrub or like hair. And a very common one is usnea, or a beard lichen. So in terms of physiology, all lichens turn air into life. They need clean air, and they're also used as an indicator of air quality. So if you see lichen growing on your trees, that's a good sign that you've got clean air, because they don't exist where air is heavily polluted. They cannot thrive in that environment. Lichen need to pull nutrients out of the air in order for the algal cells to do their work and for the fungi partners to survive. I just want to show you a few portraits. Cladonia, we saw those at the very beginning, these pixie cup lichens. There's also one that's called lipstick cladonia, or Cladonia macilenta, and these are beautiful. And these are the red is the spore forming portion of it, so they're not red all year long, but if you happen to catch them during this period, they're absolutely stunning. And these are really tiny. I mean, these pixie cups are really, sometimes they're less than an inch tall, and they can be, just a few millimeters sometimes. So they're quite small. These are close-up photographs that were taken to get a good picture of these miniature little clubs that they form. These pictures I actually took when I was hiking on Vancouver Island several years ago, and I got so enthralled on my walk because I saw lichen that I don't see in my woods here on my property in Skagit County. One of them that's really fun is this Loberia pulmonaria. I mean, these lobes are so big, they're like lettuce leaves, and they tend to be greenish on the top and beige on the bottom. And I have now found a growth in my personal woods, but it's pretty unusual. These take a lot of moisture. Another fun one is called Electoria sarmentosa, or common witch's hair. And some of these can hang down several feet from trees. You oftentimes see them in swampy areas where the trees are undisturbed. And then another one that's really interesting is the Vernia prunastri, or antlered perfume. And you'll find this oftentimes on deciduous or coniferous trees. And they make the most beautiful shapes, like this one here, with very long club-like structures that are quite beautiful. On that same walk, I've also found quite a few Cladonia species here standing back on a rock, and then I went in for a close-up because I wanted to see these. And once again, you oftentimes find the lichen growing side by side with moss, but this was pretty beautiful here. I thought such interesting life forms, and all from just paying real close attention when I was walking through the woods. Here's another beautiful lichen portrait right here in Skagit County. For those of you that know the Mount Vernon area, this old barn is pretty close to Christensen's nursery on Best Road. And at the right time of year, this lichen is just this bright gold that's quite beautiful, and it's just been there for years. I keep an eye on it every year to make sure it doesn't go away. But Nancy Kroll caught this lovely, lovely photo of this beautiful lichen. And here's just a few more photos before we talk, switch gears a little bit. I've mentioned many times that in the woods, you'll oftentimes find lichen growing side by side with mosses. These are several different examples. Here's some more of that crustose lichen that's like spray paint almost, along with some beautiful mosses on this particular tree trunk. So lichens have been used for, in many ways by humans. One is for dyes, especially things in the more natural shades, the darker shades, the browns, etc. They've been pretty useful for that, for clothing, bedding, timber. As medicine, they've been used in an antibiotic form. The powdered usnea can be a good antibiotic. They also tend to repel insects, and they've been used in the formation of perfumes and cosmetics. They're used as for food, soups and different breads are sometimes flavored with lichens, as well as things like alcohol and molasses, and also as a livestock feed. In wildlife, caribou, lichen represent 90% of the winter diet of caribou. And in terms of nests, like I showed you at the very beginning, and a hummingbird's nest, more than 50 species of North American birds actually use lichens to build their nests. Hummingbirds are some most famous, but any bird nest you look at, you would not be surprised to find lichen as part of the matrix when they're building their nests. So before we wrap up, I wanted to just share with you what HortSense says about mosses and lichens. So we've talked about the fact that they're primitive plants. They can be found growing on the bark of old trees and shrubs. They can be also found on soil and on rocks. They're typically grayish, greenish, or although we've seen some that were also bright yellow and even some red. They're not parasitic and they will not harm trees. It's one of the questions I get asked most often when I'm talking about both lichens and moss, but particularly lichens, is aren't those harming my trees? And the answer is no, they're not. However, lichens are oftentimes associated with shaded trees that are, or ones that are declining. They don't cause the decline, but they do find adventitious places to grow on trees that are declining. If they bother you, if you don't like the look of shrubby growths, lichen growths on your trees, you can do more regular pruning to limit their development. Less shade, more open air will sometimes suppress that. You can also rub them off. They're pretty easy to remove, but just remember, they're not actually hurting your trees. We've already talked a little bit about management options for moss when they're a problem, but this is also true for lichen as well. If you want to keep moss and lichens from growing on your garden plants, then you want to be planting in more sunny locations. You need to make your pruning choices such that you bring more light into the canopy, where you'll have conditions where these life forms won't be as likely to grow. Also, even if you have shady conditions, as long as your trees are vigorous and you're taking good care of them and they're healthy, they won't be at any risk for any moss or lichen that grow on them. As I mentioned, you can remove the heavy buildups by hand. And even though lichen, one part of them is a fungus or two fungi, fungicides are not recommended at all for control of lichen. They won't be effective, and it would not be a good use of a pesticide that can harm other things in the environment. Okay, before I stop sharing and open things to Q&A, I thought I would just share with you a couple of my favorite quotes. George Schenk wrote a wonderful book on moss gardening, and I particularly like a couple lines, so I'll just read them to you. We pause to study moss, especially after a rain, and carry away a lasting impression of a plant velvety green and vibrant, yet soothing. And this is what I always feel like. I have that sensation of that vibrant and soothing environment every time I walk across my moss lawn. Another quote from Schenck: admiration of mosses and lichens and interest in cultivating them represents the attainment of a certain wholeness of the civilized mind, a roundness in understanding our environment. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I will stop sharing so I can see people, and I will gladly take questions.
So feel free to type your questions or go ahead and unmute and ask your questions verbally. I have one to start everybody off with. So Deborah, a few weeks ago, I started looking for peat-free potting soil, and I could not find any locally.
Yes, that's a problem. When I was doing my research on the peat moss substitutes, that was a common issue that I ran across, is that here in the United States, we don't have regularly marketed products that are peat moss free. And so you kind of have to make up your own.
Okay.
I strongly suggest trying Coir. We've been using
Right.
it quite a bit within the Master Gardener program for propagation. And some of these other wood products work well also. My reference from the New York Times, I thought, had a really good discussion of some of these alternatives. And clearly in England, there's much more aggressive work to find good commercial substitutes. So don't be surprised when you can't find them. Coir you can find at most garden centers these days. It's sold in a block, and you hydrate it and then mix it in with your other potting soil materials. And it's very good at holding water in the potting medium. And I highly recommend it, but it's not the only option.
But it also has some environmental, I mean, it has to travel a ways. So
Yes, it does. And that's why I think people are looking more at some of these other wood products, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, where we have, a lumber and timber industry, some good products that can be used as well.
I was hoping you were going to say, well, you just didn't look in the right places, and they're all over the place, but the places that I chose just didn't have it. So, okay, thank you very much. So we've got some
Trying to say this is easy. So.
Yeah, well, but it's worthwhile. All right, Val, go ahead and read questions.
Okay. And if you're willing, it's always nice as a speaker to see faces. So if you're willing to show your face, I think it makes it more personal for answering questions. So there's two that are in the chat. One is from Jen, and she wants to know, what's the best way to propagate moss in a rock garden?
I get this question a lot, and I've read some things, and a few of the books on my resource list talk about methods to do that. There are also firms that sell moss for starters. I haven't heard about much good results with that. Where I've been very successful growing moss is where it's grown naturally, and then I facilitate it to continue to grow versus trying to grow it someplace which wouldn't necessarily be the right environment. So remember, we talked about the fact that moss grows where it's damp, infertile, shady, places where you can't get other things to grow. So I would highly recommend you try to look at your garden and look at where you see moss growing and then encourage it. That picture I had where I described it across from my front door, I didn't have to do anything. And I've got 5 or 6 different kinds of moss growing there, and they've just crept in, and I just encourage them, right? I don't have, there are references than me to other more mechanical ways to do it. I've heard people talk about mixing moss up, like in a blender with things like yogurt or things like that and spreading them on rocks. I've heard those are all very anecdotal. I wouldn't particularly recommend it. And I think it only works if those conditions are perfect for the moss to take hold. I wish I could be more help on that one.
Deborah, this is Jane Billinghurst. I would absolutely agree with you that in Robin Wall Kimmer's book, Gathering Moss, she specifically says you cannot just take moss from one place and expect it to grow in another. It grows where it wants to grow. It has some quite specific conditions in terms of the moisture and the cracks, even the cracks on the surface in which it's beginning to grow. She has a heartbreaking story of someone who suddenly thought they would create a moss garden by removing moss from the wild, sticking it on big rocks in their area, and it just doesn't work. So your advice to encourage it where it already is really is the way to go. It's like right plant, right place. You can't force a plant to grow somewhere where it doesn't want to be. So you have to gently observe and encourage, I think is a good way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. To add to that, when I'm usually giving this talk for Master Gardener training, I go out in my local woods here, and I live right in the woods, and collect some samples so I can show people some live real examples. And one year I actually brought a not too big a rock that had nice moss growing on it. I brought it in to show people how it grows on the rock. And I thought, oh, I'll just stick this rock now in my garden. Well, it wasn't the same environment as where I took it out from the woods, and the moss died, right? And even though I put it in a place that I thought the moss would be happy, it didn't work. To what Jane said, I think that's really true. So the best thing is to encourage it where it's growing, and that's going to be your best success for sure. So I see a question in the chat. Is moss growing beneath vegetables in the garden advantageous? You have to, vegetables generally are going to grow in the sun, and like most vegetables need a lot of sun. If moss is growing there, I would be concerned that there's overwatering, because I wouldn't normally expect moss and vegetables to be coexistent. They aren't typically in my own garden, and I grow a lot of vegetables. I grow a lot of moss, but they're not in the same part of the garden. One thing you might want to check, a lot of people confuse things like Scotch moss or Irish moss. They're called moss, but they are not a moss. They have roots, and they can be pretty prolific in a lot of our gardens here. I find them a lot in my ornamental beds, especially where things are moist and in the shade. And they're hard to remove because they have roots, and they've kind of take hold, and they are hard to get rid of. So you might just want to look more carefully at that. Does anybody else have any experience with moss growing with their vegetable gardens? Okay. Part of the other question is dried moss a good mulching material? I don't know. None of my research has shown that up as a mulching material. I use arbor's chips mostly for mulching in my garden, or compost mulch in my vegetable garden, things like that, provide some slow release nutrients over time and prevent weed growth. I'm not saying moss wouldn't work. I just don't have personally any experience with it, or have seen it in the literature. Okay. All right.
Abigail, did you want more information? You asked, where do we get started growing a moss garden? So I was.
No, I think we covered that.
Yeah. Unless there's.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And when I do have moss growing, like I have a large bed of double file viburnums, and they create a huge amount of shade and a lot of leaf litter in the fall, and moss tends to grow under them, and I just leave it be. It's not hurting the plants. It's helping retain moisture. I mean, that's like a natural mulch, if you will, but it is growing there because it wants to grow there. So I leave it. I don't scrape it off and put something else down. It's like Jane used the terms right plant, right place. We're always trying to think about what help things grow where they want to grow, and then and avoid how many weeds you actually have to pull if you can. So well, I hope you all had fun with this, and I have a 3-page list of resources that's fairly current, and if you're really interested, I really encourage you to explore those. I just remembered I forgot to mention the names of the moss gardens that you can visit locally. There are several, And sorry, I'm just looking at my notes real quick to see if I can find where they are. They are on the resource list, but there are moss gardens here in the area. There's one down at the Washington Arboretum at UW in Seattle. There is one up in Victoria. There is Bodell Reserve over on Bainbridge Island. They all have absolutely stunning moss gardens if you're interested in going and seeing them. Once you get a moss garden established, it can be quite a bit of work to maintain it. For instance, I know in my own moss garden, I have to keep the leaf litter off of it because a thick layer of leaves will kill the moss, because remember, mosses are kind of single-celled plants. They need to be able to get the light and the water out of the air. And if you suppress that by having, a 2-inch of leaf litter on top of it, they can't survive. So some of the ways to encourage a moss garden is by paying attention to the area. And that's what you'll see in some of these moss gardens that are maintained more professionally, is they're cleaned, carefully, so that they can survive. So
When we've done the programs in the past, we have also had a field trip on the Saturday afterwards, and we went to Four Springs. And so there was a lot of examples there. And what was fun, what do you call the little thing that you use with your eye? And look, I have a mental block on the little
Loop.
a loop.
Loupe.
Yeah. And we looked at that, and it was just like looking at a forest, but it was so cool to put the loop on it and take a look at the moss and the lichen through that, because it just made it blossom. I don't know. Anyway, it was a forest in miniature, but there were lots of different places at Four Springs to look at.
Yeah.
Some
including
people
the
may
old barn.
Some people may not be familiar with Four Springs. You might want to.
Okay, Four Springs Lake Preserve. It's in the middle of the island. If you go up, is it Camano Hill Road?
Camano Ridge, I think. Oh yeah,
No,
Camano Ridge.
Hill Road.
Yeah, Camano
And
Hill.
it's
Right.
it's kind of like at the
Yes, you're
top,
right.
whether you're coming from the west side or the
Right.
east side, and it's on the north side of the road of Camano Hill Drive or Camano Hill Road, whatever it is.
Right.
I live on the north tip, so I don't go down south very often. Anyway, but it's 50 acres and it includes an old barn, so you're seeing it on there's stuff on the old barn too, besides the different trees and whatnot throughout.
Yeah. And I can guarantee you, whether you go to Four Springs or just take a walk in any woods around here, the minute you start looking at these life forms, you'll be amazed, and then you'll never look at the woods the same way again, because it opens your eyes to all these different things that are growing, and you have to get really close up. A lot of the photos I showed you were real close up photos, but you won't see that from afar. You have to get down close, take your loop, take your camera. Cell phone, these days with great cameras are a great way to blow up the image so you can see what you're looking at and identify it.
Well, thank you, Deborah, for that intro to my session next month.
That was a great one.
I have lots of macro photos of these things.
I know you do, and I can't wait to see them. Jane's also going to be giving our Know and Grow for the Master Gardeners next Tuesday, right? So if you aren't going to be available for the Camano wildlife presentation, we're doing it on Zoom next Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. And it's free. So just go to the Master Gardener website and you're welcome to join us. We can't wait to hear Jane tell us about forest walking.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Or Wednesday night, July 20th.
There you go.
7 p.m.
I also put in the chat, Ask a Master Gardener Day that we host at the Skagit County Discovery Garden is coming up Saturday, June 25th. It's a free, open to the public day where we do a lot of fun things in the garden. We have a plant clinic and plant ID table, some other activities for children, other demonstrations. The Native Plant Society garden will be open, as well as the Northwest Fruit Orchard. So it's a great way to kind of come see what we do and see our beautiful garden. The Discovery Garden, which is behind me in this picture, is really quite beautiful and accessible to all. So you're welcome to come join us.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you all very much. We will see you hopefully next month, or maybe at the Master Gardener Day. All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.